Welcome to the We Raise the Stars and Stripes Over Japan podcast. This is episode number 4. My name is Mark Steven Schwartz, and it is both an honor and a privilege for me to read for you the diaries of Allied and American civilian prisoners of war interned in and around Kobe, Japan during the Great Pacific War, World War II. We're going to continue with December 10th, 1941. Dean Brunton. The island was captured almost without a struggle. Although the military forces made a brave defense, within an hour almost all firing had ceased and most of the defenders had been captured. I held out for one day and on the following morning was persuaded by my wife to surrender. In the grounds before the government house, on the flagpole where the Stars and Stripes had flown for 43 years, I saw the ensign of the Imperial Japanese Navy. I was welcomed by 2 machine gunners and 2 infantrymen with fixed bayonets. It was a ticklish moment, but after a brief examination, I was escorted into an ancient Spanish building that had held prisoners long before the coming of Americans to Guam. Above the arched door was the coat of arms of Spain and the date 1743. Inside were most of the other American nationals, both military and civilians. Walter Buddy Durham. The Marines and I, still attached by ropes, arrived in the center of Agana, where the rest of the Navy and Marine Corps had surrendered. All Americans were separated from their families and put into the Catholic Church there in the center of town, which was about 1 block from my house. Charles F. Gregg. They fed us a ball of rice for dinner, and we slept on the cement floor and pool table in the recreation room of the Marines. The 3 groups were divided at this time, but 4 days later they were again united when placed in the Agana Cathedral. Max Brodowski. The island was captured and occupied by the Japanese forces, all Americans imprisoned, at first in the Navy hospital, then in the Catholic Church. The Japanese finally imprisoned the 500 Americans, which included all the military and civilian personnel of the island. We were at first held at the Navy hospital where the Japanese had machine guns trained on us for 4 days. Then they relaxed. Harold Brinkerhoff. We were served a good supper. I had not realized it had been 10 hours since I had eaten. So much had happened I had forgotten to be hungry. We were packed in like so many sardines. That night I slept on the cement floor under a table. We received our first education in the Japanese language. The first word was benjo, which means toilet. The latrine was out in an enclosed courtyard. To get permission to go to the head, we had to go to the guard at the door, bow Japanese fashion, and say benjo. No bow, no permission. So ended my liberty and the longest day of my life. I was so tired I slept regardless of the cement floor and the fetid atmosphere. Charles F. Gregg. Guam, Wednesday morning, December 10th, 1941. Pamphlets dropped from Japanese planes. Imperial Japanese forces with 500 warplanes have already captured the island of Luzon. Raise up your white flags and your lives and property will not be destroyed. This was after the island had been surrendered. Shimazu, with Japanese soldiers, went around Agana instructing people to display a Japanese flag, telling them to make one if necessary out of a bedsheet or white cloth by putting a rising sun of red ink or iodine. Roy Henning. In the cave until noon, island surrendered, taken to Agana, in the bullpen. Dick Arvidson. The bullpen appeared to be an abandoned warehouse or storage area and was extremely confining for the 400 or 500 people that were being held there. There wasn't enough room for everyone to lie down to sleep at night. Sleep is conducted in shifts, so some could lay down while others stood. Food and sanitation facilities were in very short supply. Reed Hubbard. The Japanese Army landed 15,000 strong, or forces of 400 Marines and sailors no match. The governor of Guam surrendered the island sometime before noon. We received orders from the U.S. military to turn in and surrender to the Japanese. Most men did this, although some waited until the next day and some straggled in weeks later. Slept the night of December 10th on a concrete floor in the Marine Corps billiard room. Bryant Sterling. Last night, December 9th, was uneventful. Art Okapinti and I got up about 5 a.m. and headed for the powder magazine again to get more food. We rode around the Marine barracks to observe the damage. Several buildings were badly damaged due to repeated bombing. Our barracks were still untouched. We stopped at the camp to pick up a suitcase. Plenty of food was left in the powder magazine. We headed for Agate with a big load. This was about 5:30 a.m. Wednesday, December 10th in Agate. We were intercepted by a man in a car looking for Fenner Road. He says the Japanese have landed at Dungus Beach in Agana and that he is fleeing for the hills. He appeared to be upset and nervous. We notified the rest of the contractors and headed up for the Fenner Road ourselves. We reached camp number 2 at Mollop Falls and quickly unloaded the food. Planes were flying overhead in distance. We hid the truck. We took a trip to the top of the hill with Clark Eldridge, Reed Hubbard, Art Okapinti, and 2 natives to watch the bombing of Sume. At the top of the hill, we were unable to see anything, but could hear the bombing and see a few planes in the distance. It was at this time we heard a terrific explosion at Cabras Island, followed by huge columns of black smoke rising hundreds of feet in the air. We were unable to tell whether the powder magazines had been bombed or if they had been deliberately blown up by our government officials. Cabras Island was blackened with smoke. A native claims he can live 2 years with his family on the taro root he has growing. I went to his hut for about an hour. It was now about 12 noon. I began to worry about the machete I left at Frank Borja's house. Frank had been a Chamorro carpenter foreman for the PNAB contractors. He and his family would be killed if the Japanese found the machete. I decided to take a truck and go get them, but driving was too dangerous due to the heavy bombing going on near Agate and Sume. Hid the truck in the bushes and returned to the native's hut. I decided to walk to Frank Borja's house to get the machete. Along the way, I met a government pickup speeding for camp number 2. 4 individuals whom I was unacquainted with told me they had just been up to Petey on Cabras Island and just blew up 2 powder houses on the island. The large powder house had set fire to a 50,000-gallon diesel oil tank, thereby causing the huge explosion and clouds of smoke we had noticed from the hill. They were the last men to flee to the hills. They were armed, pistols, several rifles, and 1 machine gun in back of their pickup. Instead of joining them, I continued walking on to Frank Borja's house, which was about 7 or 8 miles over rough country as I was afraid to take the roads. The going was pretty rough, especially under the hot sun. I decided to hide the raincoat I was carrying and tossed it with a flashlight, in the bushes. I got very thirsty, but I got lucky when I finally arrived near the coastline where the coconut trees were plentiful. I found an easy tree to climb and pulled down 5 or 6 fat coconuts. They were the sweetest I had ever had so far on the island. As I kept walking in the boondocks, I came across many farms, abundant with chickens, pigs, and other stock plentiful. But all the inhabitants had all fled for hills, abandoned, not a soul to be seen. However, when I walked past one thicket nearby, I could hear several babies whimpering and the hushed chatter of children being scolded to be quiet. I finally emerged from the thickets onto a highway. Luckily, I was within a short distance of Frank Borah's house. No one home. Frank and his family fled to the hills. I found my baggage in the back room still. I took out the machete and a straight razor and also my clothes. I hid my trunk in Borah's backyard. I could hear a plane flying low overhead. I was afraid of being bombed, so I ran out of the house. I wrapped the machete and my clothes in a burlap sack. I took 6 cans of sardines that I'd found in my trunk. Just as I make it back to the camp, a truck comes racing into the camp with 3 natives. They say we had to turn in ourselves, and according to the governor, as the U.S. has defeated the Japanese. I asked them who told them this. They said the Marines captain at Agate. This sounded fishy to me, as just then a Japanese plane flew right overhead. I decided to spurn their advice and instead go to camp number 2 and talk to the other contractor fellows before turning myself in. Being very fearful of being sighted by Japanese, I took to the hill route all the way up to Mallup Falls, climbing high mountain range. I had to pass through 10 to 12 feet of high grass. I was exhausted. I lay down and slept some. Finally, I woke up and made my way to the highway just past the reservoir. I noticed many of our contractors' trucks and depot cars in the distance near the reservoir, but I was unable to tell whether they were being driven by Japanese or contractors. I decided to stay clear of them. I noticed 2 people hiding along the highway. They looked like natives as I got nearer, so I hailed them. It turned out to be Joe Hermes, one of the contractors, and Angelina, a native girl. They are heading for the hills too, so we decided to go together. We hear a truck coming towards us. We hid in the grass and saw it was being driven by natives to pick up whites. We hid in the grass until they passed by. We decided to go back to camp number 2. I picked up the raincoat I had hid in the bushes. Joe found a bag of food. I noticed one of the natives had moved my truck. I found my old driver, Joe Guerrero, and we helped him unload the truck. I go to his hut where I ate a beef dinner. Joe Guerrero tells me Reed Hubbard, Clark Eldridge, Art Okapinti, and Bill Falvey had turned themselves into the Japanese. Clark Eldridge left orders with the natives to tell all the contractors to turn themselves in. I told Joe Guerrero and the other natives that I'm not turning myself in, so they offered me some food, mostly crackers in tins. Joe Hermes and Angelina were waiting for me at the bottom of the hill at a bridge. One of the contractor's Chevy V8s trucks had overturned in the creek. Apparently, the driver didn't want the Japanese to get it. Bill Falvey's pickup was parked on the other side of the bridge, still in good condition. I head up a steep hill with Joe Hermes, Angelina, and some other natives. It was about 5:30 p.m., and we had to hurry to make our camp. I met Frank Borah's wife at the top of the hill, also a fat bamboo, retired American resident of Guam, and Ken Hardy, who tell me they are going to turn themselves in. Most of us continued walking to the top of the next hill, where we proceed to make our camp under some trees. I climbed a tree and brought down 4 or 5 green coconuts for drinking. We were hailed by natives who invited us to their camp in a nearby valley. It was a difficult approach to their camp, and its entrance was hard to find. The natives had made their camp deeply hidden in the brush. They stretched blankets out overhead for shelter.